He stepped through the bank's glass doors like he'd done it 1,000 times, but today, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Colonel James Monroe wore a worn leather jacket that had outlasted 3 deployments and a pair of scuffed boots that hadn't seen polish in years. His shoulders were still broad, but age had bent them slightly, and his silver hair peeked from under an old army cap that looked out of place in the sleek, modern lobby. The branch was all polished marble, chrome railings, and cold air conditioning, like a place that had forgotten what grit ever felt like. As he moved toward the welcome desk, people glanced up from their phones. A young man in a tailored suit leaned against the wall, giving the veteran a once-over with an eyebrow raised. Behind the counter, a greeter in heels and flawless makeup offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, already half-turned toward a clipboard. He nodded slowly, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket with fingers that twitched. "I need access to a vault." The woman blinked, confused. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, just the authorization code. And my ID." He placed both on the counter. She stared at the ID card a beat too long. It was a military issue. Outdated, weathered, but unmistakably real. Still, she hesitated. "I'll get someone to assist you," she said, standing and walking off without another word. James turned and looked around. People were watching now. His shaky hands, his worn clothes, his presence that didn't fit. A mother gently pulled her child closer. A young man in a designer jacket whispered to the person next to him and chuckled. James caught it. He always caught it. He took a breath and moved to sit on the waiting bench by the wall, resting his cane beside him. His knees ached, a gift from a parachute landing gone wrong in '91, but that wasn't what bothered him. It was the way they looked at him, like he didn't belong here, like he was lost. He wasn't. He knew exactly what he came for, and they were about to find out why his hands shook and what they used to carry. The waiting bench was cold and unforgiving. James shifted, wincing slightly as metal creaked beneath him. Across the lobby, 2 bank employees whispered near a printer. Their glances were subtle, but not subtle enough. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair and a smug expression, leaned close to the other and muttered something that made her cover her mouth to stifle a laugh. James sat still, watching the elevator doors ahead. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his paper. His hands didn't always shake like this. It came with age, with trauma, with mornings that started before sunrise because sleep was a stranger. But now, people looked at his tremors like they were weakness, and weakness was something he'd never allowed in his uniform. Behind the reception desk, a young man with a tablet stepped forward. Dressed in a fitted suit with expensive cufflinks and slick shoes that had never seen mud, he carried the air of someone who'd never been told no. "Sir?" he called out, louder than necessary. James raised his head. "I'm Devin. I'm the floor manager here. Can I ask what you're trying to access again?" James repeated himself patiently. "The private vault. I have a deposit there. Been more than 30 years, but it's still under my name." Devin glanced at the ID in the paperwork. He made a show of squinting, then flipped it back toward James with 2 fingers. "This ID's expired, sir." "It's a military ID that's permanent. You can verify the number." Devin's lips curled into a practiced smile, the kind you use with someone who's clearly wasting your time. "I'm not sure what kind of vault you're referring to, but these facilities aren't walk-in. You can't just show up out of nowhere and ask us to open something without verification. I called 2 weeks ago, was told to come in person. The code is there." Devin folded his arms. "Well, I wasn't told, and frankly, you should have made an appointment." Behind him, another teller leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Devin smirked and shook his head slightly, as if the veteran were a stubborn child refusing to leave a candy store. James caught the whisper. Maybe he thinks he's in the VA. Poor guy's probably confused. James straightened his back. Confused? He'd navigated war zones, outsmarted insurgents, pulled injured soldiers from burning wreckage with half his ribs broken. He knew what confusion looked like, and this wasn't it. This was patience. This was the moment before the storm. But to everyone watching, he was just an old man in a faded jacket with hands that wouldn't stay still. Devin let out a sigh sharp enough to cut glass. "Sir, this isn't a community center. We're a private financial institution. If you're here to open a checking account, we can have someone assist you, but you can't just say the word vault and expect us to roll out a red carpet." James didn't flinch. He looked the manager square in the eye, not with anger, but with a kind of calm forged in places Devin would never survive. "I didn't come here for a handout," he said evenly. "And I didn't come to be talked down to by a kid in shiny shoes." The room went still. A couple nearby paused mid-conversation. A security guard near the front desk shifted his weight, watching more closely now. Devin's nostrils flared. "Excuse me?" James pulled out a creased envelope from inside his coat. The edges were yellowed, the paper fragile. "This contains the vault number, the original deposit date, and a code only 2 people ever had, me and your regional director, if she still works here." Devin didn't even look at it. "Sir, I'm going to ask you nicely. If you don't have updated identification and a valid appointment, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises." James exhaled through his nose. "And if I don't?" Devin gave a tight, rehearsed smile. "Then I'll call security. We've had issues before with vagrants. Can't be too careful these days." That word, vagrant, it hit harder than Devin knew. It wasn't just an insult, it was erasure. James had slept in tents under enemy fire, not sidewalks. He'd survived bombings, led recon missions, buried friends. He'd stood in the Oval Office once, for God's sake. But none of that mattered now. Not to this boy in a blazer who couldn't see past the tremble in his hands and the creases in his jacket. "I suggest you leave before we escalate this," Devin added, now speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. People were watching openly now. A few chuckled. One woman near the exit shook her head like she pitied him. A man in a business suit muttered, "This is sad." James stood up slowly. No one moved to help him. He gripped his cane, steadied himself, and held the envelope out one last time. Devin stepped back like it was diseased. "Security," he called. A large man in a dark blue uniform approached, already reaching for his radio. James looked at him once, saw the hesitation in his eyes. Maybe the guy had family in the military. Maybe not. But he followed orders just the same. The guard took James by the elbow, not hard, but firm. "Let's go, sir." James didn't resist. As they walked him to the doors, the whispers grew louder. He heard one woman laugh. Maybe he thought this was a museum. The doors swung open. The cold wind hit his face. He'd been thrown out of worse places. But not like this. Not when all he tried to do was leave something behind for the only person that ever mattered now. His daughter. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, sealing him out like he was some kind of intruder. James stood on the curb, hands trembling not from age, but from fury now. Quiet, buried, restrained fury. The kind he hadn't let surface in years. The kind he was trained to suppress. Behind the glass, people resumed their lives, their jokes, their appointments. Devin was already talking to someone new, flashing his salesman smile like nothing had happened. The same people who had watched him get walked out were now pretending he'd never been there at all. James adjusted the strap of his cane over his wrist and reached for the envelope again. He stared at the fading ink. He could still hear the voice of the woman who helped him write it 3 decades ago, long before cancer took her. His wife. She'd said, "If anything happens to either of us, this is where it'll be. For our little girl." He'd sealed the letter and the deposit with a hand that didn't shake back then. Not even when mortar shells fell like thunder. Now, in the heart of the city he once protected, he was being laughed out of a bank like some senile old fool. He turned to leave, but just then, the bank security guard stepped outside. James didn't even look at him. But the guard spoke. "Hey, for what it's worth, sorry man, I just do what they tell me." James nodded once. "You ever serve?" The guard hesitated. "Nah, my old man did. Desert Storm. He passed a few years back." James met his eyes. "Then you know what this means," he said, handing him the envelope. The guard scanned the contents quickly. Military signatures, a handwritten code, a vault number. His brow furrowed. James stepped closer. "Tell your manager, I'm not here for a handout. I'm here to make a withdrawal." He turned and walked toward the bench outside the bank, lowering himself slowly with a grunt. The cold iron frame dug into his back, but he sat tall, waiting. Inside, Devin was laughing again, loud enough for customers to hear. "Next time he comes back, I'll have the retirement home on speed dial." Someone laughed too loud, but one older woman near the back had stopped moving. She stared out the window. Her eyes were fixed not on Devin, but on the man outside. Her husband had trembled like that too, near the end. He died with the flag on his chest, not a tie. She walked toward the front desk. "Excuse me," she said quietly, pointing out the window. "That man, what did he say his name was?" The teller looked up, uninterested. "Something Monroe. Why?" The woman's face paled. "Colonel James Monroe?" she asked slowly. The teller blinked. "I think that's what he said." The woman didn't answer. She was already reaching for her phone. Inside the bank, Devin was halfway through another smug joke when the front doors opened fast and hard. A woman in her 70s stepped through, her heels clicking with purpose. Her voice sliced through the lobby like a whistle on a battlefield. "Where is the man you just threw out?" Everyone turned. Devin blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" She stepped closer. "The man. The older gentleman with the cane. What was his name?" Devin shrugged, already bored. "Some guy claiming to have a vault. Didn't have the right paperwork. We asked him to leave." The woman pulled out her phone and held up a picture. It was an old photograph, slightly faded. In it, a much younger James Monroe stood in uniform, surrounded by soldiers in desert fatigues. Sunlight bounced off his medals. The nameplate was clear. "Monroe. This man saved my husband's life in Kuwait. He dragged him out of a burning convoy under enemy fire while injured himself. My husband never forgot him. Neither did I." Now the whole room had stopped. Devin's eyes darted around, unsure what to say. "That was a long time ago." She locked eyes with him. "Then maybe you should have thought twice before putting your hands on a decorated war hero." Across the room, the security guard who had escorted James out stepped back in, holding the envelope. He walked straight to Devin and placed it on the desk, then cleared his throat. "You should look at this again." Devin opened it, his face tightening as he read. His eyes scanned over the official military seals, the handwritten instructions, and the access code tied to a dormant vault authorized by the regional director herself. A vault that hadn't been touched since 1993. His voice wavered. This can't be right. No one told me about this." The woman didn't move. "Maybe because you were too busy judging his jacket to read the name." Devin swallowed hard, now flipping through the paper again, desperate for a loophole. At that moment, the front door swung open again. This time, it wasn't a woman with a photo. It was a black SUV pulling up right at the curb. Tinted windows, government plates. Devin's mouth dropped. A sharply dressed woman stepped out, heels tapping with military precision. Her blazer bore the logo of the bank's regional office. She walked in without slowing down. "Where is Colonel Monroe?" she said without looking at anyone in particular. Devin raised his hand weakly. We escorted him out. I didn't know who he was." The regional director turned toward him, cold and direct. "You didn't recognize the man whose name is on our legacy security registry? The man whose trust fund pays our veteran housing outreach program? You didn't even ask?" Silence. Dead, heavy silence. Her eyes scanned the envelope on the desk. Then she looked at Devin like he was something stuck to her shoe. "Call him back in, now." Devin didn't move. So the security guard stepped past him and walked toward the exit. He opened the doors wide. James was still sitting there, eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun like he wasn't in any rush. But now, everyone was. The doors swung wide, and the sound of polished shoes on tile was suddenly drowned out by silence. James opened his eyes and looked up. The same security guard who had led him out now stood respectfully beside him. "Colonel Monroe, they'd like you to come back inside. The regional director is here. She apologizes for the confusion." James raised an eyebrow. Confusion? The guard hesitated, then nodded once. "She's waiting." James stood slowly, gripping the handle of his cane, not because he needed it just yet, but because he earned it. Every bruise, every fracture, every scar had a story, and this time he wasn't hiding them. As he stepped back into the lobby, the change was immediate. No laughter, no whispers. Eyes that had mocked him minutes ago now looked down. Devin stood stiff near the welcome desk, pale and sweating, visibly shrinking under the weight of his own arrogance. The regional director stepped forward and extended her hand. "Colonel Monroe, my name is Elise Bryant. I'm so sorry for the way you were treated today." James took her hand firmly. "I was treated exactly how you'd expect when you let kids run a place that guards people's legacies." She nodded, eyes flicking toward Devin. "That's being corrected as we speak." Devin stammered, I didn't know who he was. I thought—" "You thought he was disposable." Elise cut in sharply. "You thought he was slow, confused, maybe even homeless. You thought wrong." She turned to James. "Please, let me personally escort you to the vault." The tellers parted like waves. The security guard held the elevator door open with both hands. As they ascended, Elise glanced at him. "We've only had 3 people in our entire company with a legacy vault like yours. Yours is the oldest, and the only one tied to a military codex. We reviewed the file after your last call, but clearly not everyone was informed." James didn't answer. He watched the numbers climb on the elevator panel, his jaw tight. They reached the top floor. No background music here, just a long hallway of matte black walls, security cameras, and a final door with a steel scanner. Elise handed him a keypad. Code, thumbprint, then voice confirmation. James nodded. He typed in the numbers, slowly, but precisely, placed his thumb on the scanner. The green light flashed. Then his voice. "Colonel James Monroe. Authorization code Sierra Victor Tango 4. The vault door clicked. Then it began to open, heavy gears grinding, locks unlatching one by one, until the reinforced steel split down the middle. Inside, a single room, dimly lit, one box on a raised pedestal, polished wood, gold trim, no dust. James walked in alone. He opened the box and stared at its contents. A folded American flag, a stack of documents, and a sealed envelope addressed to Rebecca Monroe, his daughter. He lifted the envelope, slid it into his jacket pocket, and let out a long, quiet breath. Outside, Elise waited respectfully. When he emerged, she bowed her head slightly. "I hope we've corrected our mistake, Colonel." James looked over her shoulder at Devin, who now stood red-faced, arms crossed tight, like he wished he could disappear. James stepped closer to him. "No," he said calmly, "you haven't corrected it yet." Devin looked up, startled. "You'll correct it when you stop assuming the people who built this country don't still walk through its front doors." Then he turned to Elise. "Now you've got a chance to fix that." James hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a hand, but the weight of his words hit harder than any reprimand Devin had ever received. For a moment, the lobby held its breath, frozen under the tension of quiet authority. Devin opened his mouth like he wanted to defend himself, but there was nothing left to say. Elise turned toward him, her voice cold and sharp. "You embarrassed this institution. You embarrassed me. And most importantly, you humiliated a man who put his life on the line so you could sleep safely in your apartment every night." Devin's face drained of color. "Collect your things," she said flatly. "Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately." He blinked. "You're serious?" One of the nearby security guards, not the same man who had walked James out, stepped forward. Elise didn't even look at him. "I don't repeat myself, Mr. Carter. You don't belong here." Customers in the lobby were watching openly now. No one was laughing. The same people who had whispered and chuckled earlier now stood silent. A few even nodded in approval. Devon's jaw clenched. "So that's it? I get fired because I didn't recognize Because you disrespected a man who deserved your gratitude?" she snapped. "Because you used your position to humiliate someone you should have been honored to serve." The other guard gestured toward the hallway. Devon grabbed his tablet from the counter and walked stiffly past James, unable to make eye contact. His steps echoed like retreating gunfire, sharp, rapid, empty. James stood still, watching him go, not with glee, not with smugness, but with the quiet resolve of someone who'd seen enough men fall, some by fate, others by ego. Elise turned back to him. "There will be a formal apology sent to your home, and a company-wide memo distributed by the end of the day." James raised a brow. "A memo?" She nodded. "From now on, all staff will receive mandatory training on legacy clients, especially veterans, and I'll be leading it myself." He gave a faint nod. "Good. But don't just train them to recognize our names. Train them to look us in the eye." A man in line stepped forward, older, wearing a worn navy cap. He saluted James without saying a word. Then a woman in a suit came over and touched his shoulder gently. "My father served too. Thank you." It wasn't applause. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was respect. Real. Earned. And this time, the room felt it. The bank staff cleared a path as James walked back toward the main lobby. No one dared meet his gaze now. Not out of fear, but something heavier. Shame. The kind that settles in when a truth is too loud to ignore. He didn't strut. He didn't smile. He walked like he always had. Steady. Deliberate. With the weight of memory behind every step. Except now, the weight wasn't just his. It was theirs too. Elise stayed close, but gave him space. She knew enough not to crowd a man who had once coordinated air support while bleeding out in the dirt. She didn't try to smooth things over with corporate lingo or another hollow apology. She just walked with him. They returned to the front counter. The teller who'd ignored him earlier looked up and quickly lowered her eyes. James paused beside her. Without bitterness, without sarcasm, he said, "One day you'll learn that service doesn't always wear a suit." She nodded, cheeks burning. "I'm sorry, sir." He gave a short nod. That was enough. At the entrance, Elise held the door open for him herself. The cold air rushed in, but this time, it didn't bite. Before stepping out, James turned back. "I didn't come here to prove a point. I came to make good on a promise." Elise tilted her head. "To your daughter?" James pulled the envelope from inside his coat. "She's getting married tomorrow. I wanted her to have something that reminded her where she came from. Not just the medals, not just the money, the story, the fight." He tapped the envelope. "It's all in here. Letters from the field, photos she's never seen, the last piece of her mother's handwriting." Elise's voice softened. "That's beautiful." James looked down at his hand, still trembling. "She always asks about my hands, thinks I'm sick, but I tell her the truth. I tell her they shake not because I'm broken, but because I held on, through things she'll never have to see." Then he stepped outside. The sky had started to shift, clouds breaking just enough to let sunlight warm the sidewalk. He stood still for a moment, letting it hit his face. Behind him, the doors closed with a quiet hush. But this time, they didn't shut him out. They just let him go, on his own terms. The walk to his car was slow, but not hesitant. Every step felt lighter now, not because the pain had gone away, but because the weight of being unseen had finally been lifted. James reached his old Buick, a dusty, dented reminder of simpler times. He opened the door, slid in, and placed the envelope gently on the passenger seat like it was made of glass. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the wheel, hands resting on his knees. His reflection in the rearview mirror caught his eye, the crow's feet around his eyes, the gray crawling through his beard, the lines carved by memory and loss. All of it had been earned. He thought about how easily it could have ended differently, if he'd lost his temper, if he'd walked away, if that woman hadn't spoken up. But he hadn't come for revenge. He came to honor a promise. And he had. He remembered the first day he'd opened that vault, back in '93, fresh from his final deployment. A younger man with a chest full of medals and a heart still heavy from what he couldn't leave behind. He and his wife had walked into the bank together that day. She had held his hand as they locked away the box. "It's not just money," she told him. "It's memory. It's legacy. She'll need that someday, when we're not around to explain." And now, he'd done it. Not in the way he expected. Not quietly. Not cleanly. But honestly, he had been seen, not as a nuisance, not as a burden, but as a father, a soldier, a man who gave everything and asked only for dignity in return. He turned the key in the ignition, and the car rumbled to life. In the seat beside him, the envelope shifted slightly with the vibration. He reached out and steadied it with one trembling hand. It was still shaking, but for the first time in years, he didn't mind. The wedding was held in a modest chapel just outside town, draped in white linen and wrapped in the kind of silence that only comes before something sacred. James stood in the back, dressed in his old dress blues. They fit a little snug now, the fabric tighter across the shoulders, but he wore them anyway. Every medal gleamed, carefully pinned by his own hand that morning. His daughter didn't know he was coming early. He wanted her to see him this way. The ceremony hadn't started yet. Guests were still arriving. Music hummed softly in the background. He walked down the side aisle and placed the sealed envelope on a small wooden table near the front, right beside her bouquet. No note, no explanation, just her name written in pen, steady and bold. Rebecca. He turned to leave before she arrived, not wanting to draw eyes. But then, her voice behind him. "Dad?" He froze. She stood in her wedding dress, veil tucked behind her shoulders, tears already in her eyes, not from nerves, but from what she saw. The uniform, the medals. The same man who once taught her how to ride a bike with a brace on his knee and a pain in his voice he never explained. She ran to him, arms flung wide, and he caught her, still shaking but strong enough to hold her, always strong enough. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. But when she looked down and saw the envelope, her breath caught. She picked it up carefully, holding it like something alive. "What's this?" James met her eyes. "Everything I never said. Everything I wanted you to know. And a piece of your mother you've never seen." She nodded, tears falling freely now. He kissed her forehead. "Be proud of where you come from. You carry all of it." She clutched the envelope to her chest, trembling now too. And when James stepped back outside, the sun was fully up. The wind passed gently through the trees. No applause, no spotlight, just a quiet stillness. The kind you only feel when something finally comes full circle. Across the street, the same bank stood tall. Behind its thick walls, a vault door remained open. Empty now, but not forgotten.